So welcome everybody. I'm pleased that you could join us today. This is going to be my final PSA online forum that I host. I hope to attend them in the future. Our next president will be the one to host them. And I'm particularly pleased that we have a topic that works well with Women's History Month. So, and I just wanted to also remind you, you probably are very much aware of this, that in April, we will not have an online forum because we are having our 5th International Edgar Allan Poe Conference, the hybrid edition. So some of us will actually get to be in Boston and others will be joining us online. And so with that, I want to turn this over to our presenters today, Tim and Brad. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen here and welcome everyone to Gender, Labor, the Marketplace, and Other Relations One Might Hide Under a Horse Blanket at Anne Lynch's salon in 1845. A perfectly euphonious title, right? I thank Amy, really, thank Poe Studies for including me as somebody who hasn't written on Poe in well, lightly a little bit, but not much in a long time. And I consider myself sort of an Oaksmith scholar, but I got the call, I guess, today for that reason, that I've been working in Poe and gender for a little while. My intentions today, bringing gender to the center of our discussion about Poe and his circle, certainly. It is, after all, Women's History Month. And, don't we all need a primer for the selected writings of Elizabeth Oak Smith? It's forthcoming from Mercer Press in 2023 and 24. Thanks to Mark Jolly and Amy for actually handing me to Mark Jolly at Mercer Press. Let's see. Yes. So I have to acknowledge that there are more significant contributions to this area of inquiry that I would consider Eliza Richards' Gender and Poetics of Reception in Poe's Circle from 2004 to be, really the real work on this. If you go to WorldCat, you'll see that's pretty much one of the most quoted sources for anything like this, Poe and gender. And then, of course, Sandra Thompson's Cheap Poe, a published essay, and then Sandra, I'm not sure if it's still forthcoming or whether it's still in process or whatever, but her article that she sent me called The Vast Pantheon of Speculation, Poe and His Women Biographers. I learned a lot from that, so thank you. And of course, this is a setup, really. I'm just trying to get out of the way as fast as I can for Greenburg's reading of a very interesting new novel, The Shadow of the Hunter, a chapter from that in which we see featured a character that you don't often see in historical novels, as Rufus Griswold. He, of course, is the central figure in discussion of Poe, gender in the marketplace. I think that he needs no introduction in this company. But I gotta say, I did a lot of work on Griswold. I've shared it with a couple of you, about 80 pages in a unpublished book manuscript on this character. And I started with a kind of conclusion where I talked about Poe's reputation being shaped in large part by attacks by Griswold and then against Griswold in the 19th century, the kind of lines of crossing fire that created a Poe for the late 19th century. And from that point, I turned though to a whole chapter on Griswold and the women. This Grand Turk who used to surround himself with women. That's what he was called in his time. And he admittedly did some real work for women writers at the time. As much as he denigrated them, he also put them on between covers in two works called, one, The Gems of the Female Poets in 1841, and the other, of course, The Female Poets of America in 1848, when he split up the Poets in Poetry of America by gender. There are our three for today's discussion. I hope you guys all remember around the time Griswold took over from Poe at Graham's Magazine in 1842, he began to serve Oaksmith as her literary agent and editor. There is no, of course, evidence that they ever attended the same evening at Anne Lynch's salon in 1845, but of course, here they are, and I've given them the setting. And I hope you note that if you had a horse blanket about, above their heads, you might actually cover them with it. So, let's start with Griswold's, famous passage often quoted, parodying the patriarchal pieties of let me just get this stuff out of my way here. Patriarchal pieties on writing and gender in the Romantic era. Let's just remind people of it. Women's capacity to mirror, he writes, may be accompanied by no power to originate, nor even in any proper sense to reproduce. It does not follow, because the most essential genius in men is marked by qualities which we may call feminine, that such qualities, when found in female writers, have any certain or just relation to mental superiority. The conditions of aesthetic ability in the two sexes are probably distinct or even opposite. And the word he uses is ability. I mean, this is an essentialist extravaganza. And it's been cited many times from the 70s. It's certainly onward. Number of famous writings on women and authorship. And, you know, I do end with my entry in the Oxford Guide to Women's Writing in the United States in 1995. And after that, it's just continued to be quoted, you know, quite endlessly. It is a representative of a position. It's not, remember, Griswold's original position. It is something he adopted. And those qualities that he's really quoting of essentially male and female authorship under patriarchal ideology of that moment, the male is considered original and creative. His authorship is stable and self-controlled, inspired. His authorship is considered independent and transcendent, or at least that is the goal. And of course, this is a subject-centered writing. On the female side, we have this understanding of an essentially derived work from somewhere else. It might be found, not made or crafted. It is fleeting in a sense, accidental, whimsical, certainly dependent on others for its production and its publication. And it is usually related to a kind of material world, even her body, emotions even counted in that sense. And she, unlike the male subject-centered, is subject to. Let's look at an expression of what seems like subjection to this ideology, right? In an Oaksmith letter to Rufus Griswold in May of 1842, she writes, "I enclose you a short poem, which I trust may please you. I do not profess to be a judge in these matters. As to prose, I have a romance upon an American subject, which I should be glad to offer you. It consists of about 250 pages in manuscript portions, which I have read to some friends, have been highly approved. We are scarcely in a situation to look after a publisher in the shape of a volume, and I should like to test it in a magazine. Shall I send you a few chapters for the August number?" And this is at Graham's magazine. I just think that this passage, this letter, is a wonderful example of that quality of a writer who hasn't written their work, but rather found it. It seems to be an object that's sort of adjacent to the writer instead of a product of the writer. Notice the verb here, as to prose, I have a romance upon an American subject. I mean, she doesn't even say she wrote it. It's just sort of lying by. And of course, this obeisance here and this sort of supplication, I trust it may please you. I do not profess to be a judge, etc. This seems to be an example of a woman in her position, according to Griswold, writing to the male position. Of course, is this internal or is it external? Is this psychological, or is it, in this case, a rhetorical following of the ideology? There were, of course, deep and real effects of patriarchal thinking on the psychology of women writers in the United States. I think Gilbert and Gubar, you know, in the 70s were really good on that. But what have we here? If, in fact, Oaksmith had already taken on the editorship of her husband's newspaper in his absence in 1833. She had already published a popular novel, Riches Without Wings, 4 years earlier in 1838. Here it is on the right. She was already publishing regularly in Snowden's and Godey's and other journals of the time, very popular journals. And she'd already published her breakout narrative poem, The Sinless Child, in the Southern Literary Messenger 4 months earlier. So is this her being occupied by this ideology in that first letter to Griswold, this sort of supplication, or is this a very conscious pose? Now compare Oaksmith's letter to Griswold in July of 1843. I enclose a story for the magazine, for which you tell Graham, Mr. Graham, he must pay in advance, for it is one of the best I ever wrote, and one of the very best. And he needn't think I will take 6 pence for it. He must send me a good round price, and thus show he's a man of sense and appreciation. Please acknowledge the reception of this. Wow, that's quite different. The tone is incredibly commanding, authoritative. You tell Mr. Graham, he must. Wow, that's not a supplication, that's a demand. Made, it seems, by kind of an equal, which Oaksmith is very quickly becoming with a number of publications. That is, what has changed between about a year and a few months before and July of 1843? Well, she's published a second novel called The Western Captive in October 1842, and she's just come out with a collection of her poetry, The Sinless Child and Other Poems, in that very month. So now she realizes she is of some value to Griswold, and that maybe Griswold needs her more than she needs him. This is really interesting. And it brings to mind, to me, a discussion of ideology and the material. And that's where we're going today. I'd say too often our students still understand ideology as a set of dominant ideas that dominate us psychologically. Sorry about the redundancy there. I meant to cut that. I don't think we remind them often enough that ideology inheres in material practices and in their relation. I guess, in fact, that our forgetting that has led to the amazing endurance of this idea of independent and original authorship even today. But this is my thesis, really. It was not enough for a goon like Griswold or any woman writer to think these things. What made them dominant, these ideas that we started with in Griswold's preface from the Female Poets, what made those ideas dominant was the material position in which we find people with beliefs like this, or different ones, as arbiters of access to publication or as writers looking for that access. So in light of this, I think there's another suggestive passage from the preface, The Female Poets of America. It's on page 3, I believe. It goes like this. It has been suggested by foreign critics that our citizens are too much devoted to business and politics to feel an interest in pursuits which adorn but do not profit, and which beautify existence but do not consolidate power. Feminine genius is perhaps destined to retrieve our public character in this respect. Wow. Pursuits which adorn but do not profit. That would be the work of women. And this, of course, I'm basically quoting Sandra Thompson's wonderful article, Cheap Poe, in which he argues how the journals of the time relied on not paying writers for their own existence, for their own profits, for their editors' profits. And those writers were very often female. Works which beautify existence but do not consolidate power. So all of a sudden in page 3 of this preface, it seems as if feminine authorship or feminine genius, let's go to that word. Feminine genius is not necessarily something reserved for women. It's reserved for people who A, do not profit, and B, who do not consolidate power. Well, that's a different story. What do we do with that oxymoron? Genius being a kind of male understood term on the left-hand side of our chart that I earlier posted, male and female, and then the feminine being on the other side. Is feminine authorship then limited to women? This is a question asked by Nancy K. Miller in the 80s. But let's move on to some examples. Poe, I would argue that he exhibits a feminized position in lots of his dealings with Rufus Griswold. This is a letter I don't have time to read, but it is a example of perhaps a pose, but also a supplication. He has insulted Griswold in a vicious attack on him in print, And now he has to backtrack. Now, under a kind of confidential head, he doesn't want to make this public, he has to apologize so that he can get back in the graces of a person who could give him access to the marketplace. Again, another letter in February of 1845. Griswold is about to come out with the Prose Writers of America in 1846. He has written to Poe, not because he's great friends with him or is made up with him, but because Poe is somebody who can fill his anthology with, work that's good and that's known and that will sell it. So Poe here in his letter presents him all kinds of options, has gone out of his way to figure out what might go in, what would be best. He's put a lot of thought into it. And it seems that in his actual publication, Rufus Griswold was in a position he didn't have to listen to Poe at all. He was in a position to decide, to create Poe's image in the public marketplace, and Poe just had to take it. Then what is a feminized author outside of the power structure of the publishing industry in the mid-19th century to do? How do you get around the structure, the material structure put in place by patriarchy, favoring certain men over all women and many other writers who were men? What does one do? Well, Greenburg's novel, you'll note, will present more creative and perhaps even more material solutions for women of the time, but you will read that novel, I hope, in the coming year. But anyway, the solutions for Poe and for Oaksmith, to achieve the elusive or even imaginary control and independence granted to male authorship, they had to occupy the position of a Griswold. They had to occupy an economic position of control. And so here we have on the left-hand side the prospectus of a journal that Poe wanted to start in 1840. He also tried this with the Stylus in 1843. Oaksmith herself tried to start a woman's journal to get out from under the control of male publishers in 1851. It was called the Egeria. I have all kinds of documents, by the way, in my selected works of Elizabeth Oaksmith about her work to bring this to fruition. But look at this quotation from Poe on the left. Experience has distinctly shown him, he's writing himself in the third person, that in founding a magazine wherein his interest should not be merely editorial, lies his sole chance of carrying out to completion whatever peculiar intentions he may have entertained. The word peculiar, of course, doubles for the word original. It doubles for the word independent. It's basically the code word for a male intention that could be carried out despite what others think. And he realizes that he can't just be editor of a journal. He has to actually materially own a journal to get into the position where he could make sure that his writing appeared the way it was conceived. And here's a wonderful blindness and insight, a letter from 1845 again toward the end. Is this the sole control that would be a male author writing, or something else? Here he appeals to Griswold. Second sentence begins, "After a prodigious deal of maneuvering, I have succeeded in getting the Broadway Journal entirely within my own control. It will be a fortune to me if I can hold it. And I can do it easily with a very trifling aid from my friends. May I count you as one of many friends. Lend me $50. So here he says it's within his own control, but the fact is it's out of his control until he can get the $50 from not just one friend, but many. And he had tried this actually with a kind of joint stock company he wanted to get together with James Russell Lowell and others. None of it sort of panned out because he wanted that kind of position of the male author without any of its compromises. There always are going to be compromises. Likewise, here's Oaksmith in her address to the National Women's Rights Convention in September of 1852. She's been doing this for a year. She's been trotting out this prospectus. I'll start where she says her prospectus. We can do little or nothing without an organ, such as our own magazine. We have no opportunity to repel slander, including which I would say the preface to the Female Poets of America. and are restricted to disseminating truth for want of such an organ. The Tribune and some other papers in the country have treated us generously, but a paper to represent us must be sustained by ourselves. We must look to our own resources. So it's an economic issue. It's not simply a psychological or ideological issue. It's ideology inhering in a material form, that is, of the publications in the marketplace. Another strategy, and this is pretty much where I'll conclude, you cut out the middleman. And by the way, all three of the figures here, Poe, Oaksmith, and Griswold, and we're going to see a reading, I believe, from Greenburg, watching Griswold at work in this mode. All three of them cut out the middleman by lecturing publicly. You didn't have to deal with an editor when you lectured publicly. You had a somewhat direct contact. As Poe showed in Boston, you didn't even have to tell people what you were going to talk about. They just showed up and they were subject to what you had to say. That sounds like the kind of control a male author would enjoy, a male authorship in a kind of reality. But it was an imperfect solution, because if you had control before your lecture, you certainly weren't in control of what happened afterwards, and afterwards to your authorship, to your reputation, and to your value in the literary marketplace. For example, when Oaksmith began to lecture publicly in June of 1851, very soon after, lampoon cartoons like this, political cartoons, appeared. Beautiful image here, courtesy of the Smithsonian, the Harry T. Peters lithography collection. If you can't read it, the caption reads, "Mrs. Turkey, having attended Mrs. Oaksmith's lecture on the emancipation dress, resolves at once to give a start to the new fashion, and in order to do it with more effect, she wants Mr. Turkey to join her in this bold attempt." And if you look at the illustration carefully, you'll see that the man here is dressing in bloomers as well. The woman who has learned from Oaksmith to be a hermaphrodite now smokes a cigar and has her husband carry the pots and pans and the baby and the parasol. I want to let you know about Cynthia Patterson's wonderful article called Hermaphroditish Disturbers of the Peace. This was the word Rufus Griswold did use for people like Oaksmith when she went on the public lecture circuit. That is, they stepped out of what he saw as their essential place. And he, no longer helped Oaksmith at that time. George Graham stopped publishing her work, and she lost the reputation that she had gained in the 1840s, and along with it, her income from that, and had to really scrape to recover. So does this leave those like Griswold in positions of male authorship? I doubt it. I would say, fortunately or unfortunately, one of the material conditions to which all writers are subject, beyond any individual's position within it, is the demand of the marketplace. On the face of it, Griswold hardly qualifies for the creative faculty of the imaginary male author or genius. Even in his own time, he's considered just an anthologist or a log roller. At worst, somebody who just sort of made money for people by knowing other people who he could put them in touch with. He needed Poe, he needed Oaksmith, he needed other writers like this to profit from. And of course, he was always subject to the shifting popularity of those writers. When Oaksmith, for example, went into her feminist career, he had to find somebody else to publish. And he was himself subject to pressures from above and limitations of his own position. In another Poe panel, I've talked about the way in which when the night he wrote the preface to the Female Poets of America, he had 3 other things to do and had to take opium to achieve the energy to do them. So the pressure is coming down from other editors, from other material demands in his universe. So our last slide here, I'd say even if no one, Poe, Oaksmith, or Griswold ever achieved the independence essential to male authorship, I think this is just really an illusion. The details of their mutual production and reproduction over time, I think, deserve more detailed study. In other words, I think all of these feminized figures in the literary marketplace of the 1840s did something to create the reputation and therefore the value of all the others. And I could detail some of those dates. there, but I think I've run out of time, and I want to stop here and maybe hand it over to my colleague, Brad Greenburg of Northeastern Illinois University.
Thanks, Tim. Everybody hear me okay? I'm not using headphones or anything. Okay, it's good. We're all very used to this by now, so I should be good at it. So I'm afraid you're going to think Tim like put me up to this whole chapter and maybe the whole book if you ever read it. It's really on the nose. Although it's not like I just certainly didn't write it in consultation with anyone. I wouldn't know how to do that. But so, well, anyway, let me say a little bit about the book, and I won't go on too long. Well, anyway, so I'm an early modernist. I'm a Shakespeare scholar by trade, but I frankly mostly write fiction now outside of my teaching, and I teach some creative writing and so on as well. It's my main preoccupation and obsession, I guess. I don't know. But I seem to be stuck in the 19th century since the books I've written have been set in the middle of the 19th century in America. I'm from the Midwest, and the early stuff is set around here. So this book is set in 1863 in the second half of the summer in Washington, D.C. and its environs, and purposefully set during the war with Walt Whitman and William O'Connor and a number of historical characters. There's a long historical note at the end disclaiming, my responsibility for what I've done with people. And the first thing that you will notice, if you're already noticing, is that I have allowed Griswold to live 6 more years so that I could get some use out of him, since he died in 1857, unless I'm mistaken. And so I just had to have him. When I discovered, Tim's maybe shake his head. I don't think I discovered him through you. I think I discovered him independently. Yeah, okay, yeah, I did. And so and then I think Tim sort of steered me towards, you should look at this and look at this. And I was like, yeah, no, I can't. I have to be careful what I know. I kind of need, when I saw his picture, actually, this is going to sound really shallow, but I'm interloping into your field. So this is the only time I get to do this. So I was just really drawn to him as a kind of villainish, pretty villainy character. And he's pretty present throughout the novel, and he's not a main character, but he bears a lot of plot weight, and he does some pretty bad things. And the main thing he gets involved in later, and then I'm not going to say too much about the rest of the book, is there's a scheme to find young women in order to furnish generals and other military brass with, let's just say it, with prostitutes, because these men are in the field and they're not always able to come to DC. And so there's like this service. This is based on something I stumbled across in doing research for the book, that Lafayette Baker, who was special provost marshal at the time in DC, and some others were allegedly, probably, involved in. And so I just took it and ran with it and used it. There's not much detail. I'm tempted to go into a bunch of things here, because writing a historical novel means you go down a million rabbit holes, and you really have to be careful. Lafayette Baker is his own subject, and it would be a fun thing to talk about at some other point if anybody knows anything about him. He sort of wrote his own story, and everybody seems to have believed it. And it's clear to me that it's complete bullshit, and that he fooled everyone to thinking he was like a genius and ran a lot of clandestine Secret Service things, which I really don't think he did, but for another time. Anyway, so these incredibly lively characters were just so much fun to put in motion in the book, including Whitman. And I don't know if any of you know William O'Connor. He published a novel called Harrington in 1860. He was a very well-connected abolitionist. It was published by Eldridge and Thayer, and he had close connections to Charles Eldridge. And Charles Eldridge appears in my novel too, because these guys moved to DC in the early 1860s to take government jobs, because nothing else was abolition wasn't paying the bills, I guess. And so we have this ensemble. O'Connor in his house sort of ran a salon. Whitman lived upstairs. And some of these characters said about, solving a mystery. A woman is murdered at the beginning, and they go down this path. So there's two major things in the novel. A dead woman whose murder they want to solve, and a Poe manuscript that has been discovered by Griswold and that he's going to publish to try to make money and his, fame and fortune, right? And obviously I've invented this, and the manuscript goes missing and gets stolen and sort of travels around through the novel and is the kind of thing everybody is after. So, wow, even just talking about it this way, it's a lot. And it only took me 6 years, to write. So this chapter that I'm going to read without further ado is chapter 5 in the novel. So it comes in, it sort of has the most Poe stuff in it, I guess, and the most Griswold stuff, and is the most family-friendly Griswold stuff that appears in the book. Some of it's a bit lascivious. So I'll just read this without further ado. The character who's is in the novel quite a bit is a woman named Sally Morgan Bryan Piatt, Piatt, and you may know her poetry. There's at least one book on her with her selected poetry, the great long introduction. I don't have it at my fingertips, so I don't. Again, research. I don't remember half the stuff I use. So her real name is Sarah Morgan Bryant Piatt, but she's called Sally, as she was in real life by people who knew her, if you read her letters and so on. And so that's what she's called in the book. So that's confusing. I haven't messed it up. Sally is her name. And she's gone. This chapter is her and her husband, who was a very minor poet from Indiana. They've gone to this Griswold lecture, and I don't think you really need to know anymore. And so here we go. Please forgive me for not being like one of those audiobook voice magic readers who does everything perfectly, because I'm not. So I'll do my best here, okay? The Poe lecture takes place in the galleried hall on the second floor of Smithsonian Castle. Sally's surprised to find the lobby buzzing with people. She tucks in behind JJ, who angles for the bar, cleaving his way through the crowd. They finagle a place to stand at the end of the long stretch of mahogany, out of the press of men shouting orders, but within the reach of the bartenders. Sally waves in vain at the cigar smoke. I thought we'd be squashed into a dusty library closet. Who knew so many people cared about Poe? JJ rolled his eyes. My dear, these people are here for the free libations. She clinks her glass of champagne to his beer, present company excluded. JJ turns to regard the crowd. Look at this lot. Not exactly a group portrait of suffering in wartime. He finishes his beer and orders 2 more. Sally's interest is in the lecture, her expression sour at his two-fisted preparation. He puckers his lips like a fish, and she kisses him. When those are empty, we're going in. She scoops his watch out of his vest pocket. It's time. JJ murders his beers and bribes the barman to top up his flask with rye. Sally leaves him, making her way across the smoky room and through the open doors into the main hall. The seats are nearly full. In the gallery, heads occupy the first 2 rows without exception. A small group stands chatting in front of the low stage below the lectern. She tries for seats down front, knowing people are often reluctant to sit there. It's blocked by a velvet rope, hung with a sign, reserved. Her mood falls, and with it, her nerve. We won't find anywhere to sit. Who are we, anyway? 2 unknown poetry scribblers from Kentucky and Indiana. She turns and scans the entrance for her husband. From behind her, a voice intones, Sarah Morgan Bryan Piatt. She recognizes Rufus Griswold from the picture accompanying the lecture announcement. He wears a gray suit coat, cut in the continental fashion, the buttons on his waistcoat carved from mother of pearl. It's a dandyish getup for a fellow with his features. His thick lips, high forehead, and heavily lined eyes are framed by oil dark hair. Though in his late 40s, something about him feels older, more wearied by life than seems appropriate for a man of fame and accomplishment. Griswold, apart from his position as editor of prominent literary magazines, savage critic, and infamous author of the obituary slandering the reputation of Edgar Allan Poe, draws his power as the anthologist of the first and most influential collection of American poetry, of American prose, and with particular interest for Sally Piatt, of the female poets of America. The latter volume, appearing in 1849, sits open on Sally's writing table, filled with bookmarks and penciled marginalia in her neat hand. She wishes more than anything to be included in its next edition. And here he is, and he knows her name. Sally holds out her hand and struggles to keep from blushing. He delivers a stiff bow and grazes his lips against her knuckles, his beard a wire brush. Rufus Griswold, at your service, he announces. How do you know my name? I'm a voracious devourer of American poetry, Miss Piatt. As immodest as it may sound, I've read every poet who's published anything reputable since the founding of our republic. She leaves uncorrected his use of miss. If a mistake, attribute it to her youthfulness. If flirtatious, well, she's not an amateur at that pastime. Plus, there's opportunity afoot. It has always been my aim to be reputable. She'll risk a downgrade in status to make a gambit in the game of temptation. I'd argue that reputable sets too low a value on your work, Miss Piatt. Your poems in the New York Ledger caught my attention some time ago. I'm also familiar with those appearing in the Louisville Journal, though it's a paper more difficult to come by. That belies your claim of thoroughness somewhat, sir. It does indeed. His laugh lacks enthusiasm, as if it narrowly beats back a rebuttal. I shall attempt to remedy that as soon as I'm able. Sally feels the crowd settling in behind her. The collection of men around the stage dissipates. She says, perhaps while you're in Washington. Her overture is cut off by John James, who spins her around. He's florid with drink. Sally fights the urge to lash out at him. When she turns back, Griswold is at the lectern. Madam, if you please, it's a Smithsonian employee in the dark blue livery of the castle. He unlatches the rope and gestures towards two seats in the center of the front row. Astonished, she points to herself and her husband. The man nods. Griswold coughs, rapping a gavel several times to attract the crowd's attention. Sally's surprised no one is going to introduce him. Perhaps Rufus Griswold needs no introduction, or refuses to allow one, since he does it so well himself. When he comes to the end, he offers a long pause, into which the audience deposits their applause. My lecture today, titled The Late Poe, employs, as I'm sure many of you have guessed, a play on words. Let me add at the outset that what I'm about to deliver has not been offered to the public before now. I thought it best to debut it in our nation's capital, especially as we're in the midst of a war for its very survival. The wordplay I wish to invoke concerns the death of our greatest American writer. Now that it is nearly 15 years since his untimely passing, I think it proper to crown him with the laurels that are his due. So on one hand, we have the late Poe, whose mortal body is gone, but whose work remains. And on the other, we have the late Poe in the form of the work produced at the end of his life. Left to us is the task of collection, dissemination, and judgment of its place in literary history. Today, we take a great step forward in augmenting Poe's stature, not by heaping more praise on his stories or poems, not by adducing some new feature of his novels or comparing him favorably to other writers. No, there's something more radical I must share with you. After Edgar Poe's death, I was called upon by Mrs. Clem to ask his executor of his estate, executor of his estate, as is well known. Mrs. Clem and I became great friends in laboring together to guard her nephew's reputation. After my duties were complete, she and I fell out of touch. Some 3 months ago, I received a cable from her. She'd been residing in Putnam, Ohio, with a woman who hoped to pen a biography of her Edgar, but who unfortunately succumbed to the throes of madness and was conveyed to an asylum. Since this circumstance rendered the already penurious Mrs. Clem without board or shelter, she was, she wrote, faced with a most vexing choice. She claimed to possess something she had hoped to keep secret until her death, even if it could deliver her from destitution. But now she could perceive no other way forward, save perhaps taking her own life. And this, she added, she could not do as a devout Christian woman. For a sum that I will not disclose, as art and modesty forbids, I was able to purchase this item from Edgar Poe's next of kin. Griswold reaches down and out of a finely made leather satchel retrieves a thick manuscript bound by boards and ribbon. He exhibits it over his head for all to see. Ladies and gentlemen, Edgar Allan Poe is not dead. His body may have left this earth, but his work lives on. Born again now in this newly discovered text, I give you late Poe. Stunned silence. Griswold keeps the book aloft as if it will deliver the balance of the lecture to speak about itself. When it does not, a murmur of voices whispers their questions, giving way to a rising tide of supposition about what manner of creation it might be. Sally twists in her seat to gauge the reaction of those behind her. She feels John James's lips on her ear, his boozy breath on her neck. You want me to rush that fool and take his fancy book? He figures he's making sport, but he's dead serious. When he tries to stand, she catches hold of his collar. Griswold returns the manuscript to its bag and waves his hands for quiet. This necessitates a few raps from the gavel. I know you have questions, he begins. Today I'll sketch out some of the themes of Poe's work as it developed from his early publications to later ones. Into this context, I'll situate this previously unknown work, but only in broad strokes. An edition, prepared by myself, is to be produced by the esteemed Boston publishing house of Ticknor and Fields. You will forgive me if I maintain a determined secrecy of the volume's contents. It is, Mr. Fields assures me, paramount for its success. Paramount for your success, John James adds, and for Ticknor and Fields' bottom line, Sally mutters. She knows she should be excited at this news. Since she was a girl, she'd been an avid reader of Poe's tales of suspense. Griswold speaks for another hour. Sally thinks it odd there are no quotes from the newly discovered material. The filler consists of ample quotation from Poe's known works, meant to demonstrate points Sally finds obvious. John James leans his head upon her shoulder and sleeps quietly. In closing, Griswold announces, taking a drink of water, she nudges her husband awake. I would offer one final observation from Mr. Poe. I quote, "The value of every book is a compound of its literary value and its physical or mechanical value as the product of physical labor applied to the physical material. But at present, the latter value immensely predominates." End quotation. It is my sincere belief as an expert anthologist with 30 years in the trade that our dear departed Edgar has it exactly right. For what is the aesthetic value of a book no one can read? Of what value are pages locked away from readers? He fixes those assembled with a stern, probing glower, panning across and into the gallery. Thank you for your kind attention. Griswold steps to one side of the lectern to bow deeply. Sally rises to her feet, John James slumping over into her seat. She mounts the steps and is at his side before she knows what she's doing. Mr. Griswold, sir. He removes his hand from an old gentleman's who continues to speak even after Griswold leaves him. I must say that I'm shocked at your method of deploying a writer's words to the opposite effect of their intent. Ah, Miss Piatt, intent is a devilishly tricky. Let me finish, sir. As I was saying, Poe's comments taken out of context give an inaccurate account of what he endeavors to establish, which is that the literary value, so long oppressed, will soon rise up to supplant the overbearing guild, a man's guild, by the way, of publishers and their factors. She offers a tight, ameliorating smile, with all due respect. A cloud passes over Griswold. It takes a visible effort for him to offer an expression of indulgent patience, as if in receipt of an inappropriate question from a schoolgirl. Poe's words are as they were given. Not one word has been added or subtracted. Now, is that so? She looks him squarely in the eye. After Poe writes that the latter predominates, he adds, it will be seen, however, that the new condition of things will at once give the ascendancy to the literary value. In the new regime, the humblest will speak as often and as freely as the most exalted. So you see how I'm a woman, Mr. Griswold, not an idiot. I thought no such thing, madam. I only mean, well, are you not captivated by the Poe revelation? I should think that trumps arcane disagreements of citation. Sally forces herself to adopt a more conciliatory tone. I am indeed. It's a privilege to have been here for such an announcement. The Capitol will be abuzz. I'm sure a slew of reporters are waiting to speak with you. She surveys the room with no success. And I must locate my husband. So I bid you, he's so close to her ear, she retreats a step. Would you and John James care to join me at the Willard Hotel for a celebratory drink? Sally will later wonder why she did not catch it. Griswold's familiarity. But she's swept up in the moment. She envisions the volume with his name adorning the flyleaf sitting open on her desk. It's a lonely place, that desk, where she spends many hours in desperation over the feeling she'll never amount to anything. John James wants babies, and she cannot hold out much longer. To be honest, Mr. Griswold, my husband has already celebrated enough for today. I think it best if we say goodnight. Griswold seizes her arm and conducts her to JJ, who's in the midst of an animated discussion with a fellow sporting enormous hair. John James breaks off when he spots their approach. Here's Sally. Hey, sweetheart, you know we're always asking who actually reads Longfellow? Well, feast your eyes. He doubles over with laughter. The fellow with the curly locks, as if formed by a tall conical hat, turns crimson. He puts up his fists. She tries to steer John James away, but he tears free. Give him a few stanzas of Hiawatha's photographing, Sal. People are watching. JJ's shoulders slump like a little boy denied candy. Oh, come on. He sweeps his hand in an arc. Look at these people. Well-fed foo-foos and fancy duds, not one of them with any idea of what real poetry is. The liquor has stoked his temper. Sally knows there's going to be a fight. To stave off the blows that are looming, she assuages her husband with his favorite punchline. He would hold a scroll of something, hold it firmly in his left hand. He would keep his right hand buried, like Napoleon, in his waistcoat. He would contemplate the distance with a look of pensive meaning, as of ducks that die in tempests. It's doubtful the Longfellow aficionado knows Lewis Carroll's parody, but J.J. Piatt does. Ducks dying in tempests never fail to pull his mirth trigger. His laughter is just picking up steam when the fellow with the remarkable hair punches him in the face. An escalating rumpus ensues. It bears all the characteristics of a brawl at a literary gathering. Wild swinging, slapping, an awkward headlock, two fellows pulling each other's ties, and a gray-haired matron kicking a man in the shins. John James and his antagonist go to ground and roll to and fro in an embrace that, in other circumstances, could be mistaken for love. Sally tries unsuccessfully to break it up. There's no getting between them, and even if she could, she has on her best dress, and there's no money to repair it. To her relief, the doors at the top of the aisles are flung open, and the shrill whistles of the police fill the hall. Griswold's lips are again at her ear, causing her to shudder involuntarily. Take this, he whispers. He slips a small object into her hand. The man with the towering hair encircles her husband's neck with his hands and begins to drum his head into the hardwood floor. Anxious about the state of JJ's skull, she glances at it, a key, and plunges it into her handbag. Sally Morgan Bryan Piatt, youngest child of 5 and the only girl, grew up scrapping with her brothers. Stepping behind the two men on the floor, she lifts her skirts, draws back her boot, and with all her strength kicks her husband's assailant in the balls. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that reading. And now we're going to go ahead and open up for questions and comments. I've enabled the chat box, but the group here knows how we do it. You could either type in the chat box or you can use the raise hand icon, and we will ask some questions. I'm sure Brad may want to reserve the right to say we have to just buy the book if we have certain questions, so which we understand. So, all right, Leslie, please.
Thank you so much for this terrific presentation, and I got so much pleasure out of listening to the fiction. That was really great, and I loved foo-foos, you know, one of Whitman's words. And there was just, it was so rich. I really like that. But I do have a kind of a comment for Tim. And you know, yesterday I had the pleasure of attending another one of these Zoom meetings, and it was for Society of the Study for American Women Writers, and there was a discussion of 2 new books, and one is by Claudia Stokes, and it's called Old Style Unoriginality and Its Uses in 19th Century American Women's Poetry. And I was thinking about, you know, how, well, interestingly enough, in that discussion, Poe came up. And, you know, of course, Poe, you know, with his obsessions about originality and, you know, what you were saying about the sort of feminized position as the unoriginal position, I think that you might really like this new book, and it would fit in exactly with, you know, what you're talking about. And it just seems to be like part of the zeitgeist at the moment. So I just wanted to put that out there, and that I found the presentation very, you know, provocative, and I appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I tell you, I've actually had another endorsement for that on Zoom on Facebook. Melissa Olmsted just raved about it, and I was just sort of cursing myself. I've been super under the gun. We had program review due like a week ago, and I just finished it last night. So thank you, Brad. Claudia Stokes' book, I have to put it on my list.
All right, thank you. Sandy, go ahead.
Oh, thanks both of you for those really interesting talks. I'm curious, so this is a totally like non-critical question, but I'm curious whether either of you found any information about Griswold and George Foster. Did you find any information about those two? Because they were roommates, right, in New York. And George Foster was the nativist Flânner sort of chronicler of New York, and it's just there's the relationship. I'd like to know more about it. I think also Griswold was the architect of the Mammoth Press as well in the late 1830s, which I'm sure you know. But anyways, I was just curious whether you had any insight, because Griswold didn't start as a kind of promoter of other people's reputations or of this great anthologizer. He started in more sort of nitty-gritty journalism and circumstances. I was just curious whether you've found anything there, either of you.
Was George Foster's last name Wallace, or am I getting that wrong? George Foster Wallace sounds like a...
No, George Steve, you know, the New York by lamplight, New York by gaslight, rather.
I would have to bring back my notes from that, but so you're absolutely right. It's only in the 40s.
Here it is. Just a sec. I've just got it. Sorry. I just got it here.
40s that I was aware that he started to realize that as a compiler he could make more money than he could, you know, on, you know, producing newspapers. But you're right, the Boston Notion and other mammoths of the time, that these guys all knew one another, and
well, they started, yeah.
Floor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they started the brother Jonathan, right? He and
Oh gosh.
for heaven's sakes.
Right.
I'm blanking on what's his name, the New England poet. He was the editor. It'll come to me in a second.
Yeah.
Park Benjamin.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah. So Stuart
And
Blumen
Puts
has
off as the new world. Exactly.
yeah. So well, this is hopeless. Wait, I'll take off. Got it. I should take it off my background, but it's too complicated right now. Yeah, so Stuart Blumen has a collection of these: New York by Gaslight, New York by Naked, New York Naked was another one. And they were sort of urban exposés. And they had some kind of relationship, and I just don't know what it was. But anyways, that's okay. And
No, I
thought
remember the name vaguely, but that's it.
yeah. Okay.
So I am in a, maybe I can just ask you a question in return about a mammoth question. I was dying to know, you saw me quote the letter where Oaksmith offers Griswold what was going to be the Western captive. And according to Charles Fenno Hoffman, she had it with her already written when she arrived in New York. And she's trying to shop it, and she ends up giving it to Park Benjamin for the literary world, or the thing behind me.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you've got it behind you. That's what, of course. Okay,
right.
Yeah, okay.
So,
go ahead.
So my question is, I knew that Griswold and Park Benjamin were friends, but once Griswold maybe even had the manuscript, did he hand it off to Park Benjamin? I
don't know, because Park Benjamin worked he was a literary agent. He was the first sort of literary agent, whereas was what I was able to find anyway. So he worked especially for women, who couldn't sign their own who couldn't sign their own contracts and things like that, and who found negotiation of the publishing market very tough.
The wonderful article that you're referring to, and I can't remember who wrote it, but it was, Park Benjamin, literary agent, right?
Yes, that's right.
60-page
right. And I blanked on that too. That's right. Wasn't he Lydia Maria? Sorry, we're descending into like geekish minutia here. Was he a literary agent for Lydia Maria Child too?
Yeah, Ben.
I don't know. Anyways,
the Foster sounds like something that Brad's rabbit hole, because thankfully Brad's novel is in Washington D.C. and he didn't need.
It's earlier than that. So Brad, you may not have just gone back that far for Griswold, because he's this he was born in really poor circumstances, kind of, and worked his way up, which you probably know. But anyways, it was really interesting, and excuse me for getting into the nerdy weeds of it all. I'll go ahead. Anyone else who has some questions?
Okay, Alex, did you want to ask or comment on something?
Oh yeah, sorry, no video. Somehow it's died. A connection of sort of the novel and Tim's work. Having Griswold discover a manuscript that he's able to get out of Maria Clem, or to any views on Griswold's efforts with Clem to buy the letters, I think, to Poe of Fanny Osgood. He's desperate to get them. She says, "I'm not going to sell them," and burns them with others. I'm just curious about any sense of what's at work there beyond this personal lien that Griswold clearly has in reference to Osgood.
Brad, did you run into anything like that with the Maria Clem connection?
The process is just so different. As you know, it sounds like a cop-out, but novel researching means that you have to do these surgical strikes of knowledge, where I think of it like robbing a house. If you just go in for the valuables, you're not making a sandwich and figuring out where other stuff is going on. And so wherever I would discover, my greatest fears, of course, this kind of thing where people are like, so could you talk more about the connection where he gets a man? It's like, no, I just know enough to know that at some point, like I look up because you guys all know this, right? And if this were about like, I don't know, Shakespeare's Richard II, like I know everything about that there is to know historically, like just gobs. But of course, like I could never write a novel about it because I know too much. So it's this like strategic ignorance about the facts, but what's useful in having like Tim look at the manuscript is you don't want to get things wrong that are, I'm sorry, I realize I'm not answering the question, but you don't want to get things wrong that are just implausible, like a magazine that you make popular that nobody ever would read, or one that men read but women didn't. Because in the novel, it's a very gender aware book on purpose. Like even the woman who's murdered at the beginning is in the whole book. It's hard to describe, but like I've really tried not to write this woman dies, beautiful corpse, men do all the heroic work. It's sort of the opposite of that. And so I'm, Alexander, I'm really sorry. Like, I'm sorry. Like, I don't know anything.
The Fanny Osgood, interestingly enough, is one of the lines that I drew in my last slide. Was Oaksmith actually defends both Poe and Fanny Osgood in her correspondence to Ingram. And I think, actually Sandy's article details that. But it's interesting how she, had to elevate herself above both Poe's peccadillos and Fanny Osgood's sort of invitation to, gossip. So, and other people did as well. So it's a great question, Alexander, that the truth of that the fact that this was burned instead of known, it gets replaced in spades with all these cross currents that create the early Poe, Ingram's Poe anyway.
Indeed.
Thank you. Jeff put a comment in the chat. Jeff, do you want to say anything about that comment?
I was just going to, what I put in there was, Mrs. Clem provided all of the manuscript material to Griswold for no pay. In fact, he didn't even return any of them. Some years later, when Kennedy, John J.P. Kennedy wanted a Poe manuscript to print for an album associated with one of the sanitary fairs where they were raising money for the Civil War, she had to beg George Henry Moore to return at least part of one of the manuscripts. And unfortunately, the one that he returned, interestingly, is a whole section where Poe is copying out a section of I think it's Fanny Osgood's play from one of his reviews. It's not even his own composition, although it is his handwriting. So Griswold was very selfish and greedy. Obviously, he knew what he was up to.
I just think that's one of the most uncanny things about Brad's novel. I'm one of the only ones who read the whole, at least the draft of it, and so many details fit Griswold just perfectly in the terms that you're Jeff, you're supplying here. I mean, you will recognize Griswold throughout this book, and I don't know how he did it because he didn't really read much about Griswold.
I know a lot of mean, selfish people. Maybe that's it. I based them on administrators at the university. I don't see how they can go wrong.
Did you read any of the passages?
Are we recording this? Please.
We are recording this. So.
Did you read any of the passages from the correspondence of Griswold that his son published?
I didn't, and Tim was like, you should read these, and I'm like, I can't read those because at first, it'll. I mean, I don't want to sound completely irresponsible. Like, really, I have no desire to go big footing into territory I'm not mastering. And I think one of the tests when you do any sort of historical fiction stuff is, at least for me, like, I don't know how a lot of other people do it, but at first you have to stay a little careful not to get pulled into too much research, because it makes it very hard to write. But as you do, especially if it's a character like, again, like, let me just invoke like Lafayette Baker, like, if as I started to use him, then I start to look further, because if you look and you find out that you're like completely off, right, then you can't, I wouldn't feel good doing that. But usually what happens is, if I'm doing it properly, as much as I do further research, it will usually sort of confirm that I'm on the right track. But then to keep them a character, it's really tricky not to if you just read biographies and you read everything and you have them, for me, it makes it very hard to animate them and to get them to go on their own. I don't know if that's a common, I mean, I've read plenty of interviews with historical novelists, and I don't think I'm the only one who says this.
I make documentary films as well, and that's true. If there's too much information, unlike scholarship, where you can, there's a way of sifting things. When you're working with dramatic arcs and stuff, it's actually, you can get bogged down in things, in too much information. Yeah.
Yes, I know a lot of people who've done a lot of research and not written any novels, but I don't know very many people who've written, say, historical novels and kept the research in the right space. Those are not equal, like, lists of people, and it's great fun. It's more fun to do research than to write most days. But God, I mean, as you know, there's so many interesting things. There's so many old newspapers to read. Like, the ads in old newspapers are fatal for novelists, because you're like, oh, I have to put in, oh my God, like the material culture stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's so cool. And so
I don't know if anybody on this screen remembers the enormous theoretical fury over Lacan's seminar on the Pearline Letter.
Oh yeah.
But if you ever enjoyed it, if it was ever part of your, this novel is going to give you all kinds of flashbacks, because you just heard it. It's this wonderful text that doesn't have any content, that is circulating, and it keeps changing places and making them different, giving. And that's what I meant actually to suggest in that last slide is that everybody gets a chance to determine somebody else's identity and relationships in that triangle. And it happens a lot more elegantly and a lot more interestingly, I think, in Brad's novel.
Let's go ahead. Jeff has another question or comment.
Well, first, a sort of a stray comment, which maybe somebody wants to talk about, and then I'll ask my question. I've noticed that there's a strong trend in documentaries lately of more and more dramatization. They're not really showing so much talking heads. They're not showing so much archival material. The History Channel just did one on Abraham Lincoln. It played like a 9-hour Steven Spielberg movie. They spent a lot of money on costumes and people and I find that really annoying. I mean, if I want to watch a movie, I want to watch a movie. If I want to watch a documentary, I want to do a documentary. One of the things that really annoyed me, I think, about the documentary that they did not long ago about Poe was that they tried to have, because they paid a lot of money for Dennis O'Hare, they tried to have him be Poe. And he took up so much of the time that they really didn't get around to talking about really important things like the Gold Bug as a story and Poe winning the prize. And that documentary is full of things that, bad digressions, hopefully a good subject for discussion. But that is an interesting thing about documentaries. They're moving more and more into basically pure theater. And I guess it's because audiences don't have the attention span. But we were talking about editors, Timothy, and women editors, Miss Leslie and Sarah Hale. Now, Sarah Hale would certainly have been a very powerful editor. Dodie's ladies book, although it was strictly ladies book, was an extraordinarily popular and successful magazine, and she held that seat for a long time.
Huge. Yeah. So Sarah Hale, when so Oaksmith writes to Griswold Horace Greeley in November of 1851, and she's got the prospectus for the Egeria, and she says, you know, you want to support voices of women and other people, because he sort of got on board with a lot of radical causes. She said, why don't you put your money where your mouth is? And you know, boy, he took a lot of umbrage at that, because one of the things that she said in the letter was that there is no organ for us, that really it's ours. And he came right back at her and said, Sarah Hale and Miss Leslie, and he said scores of other women are in this position. The trouble is, you know, Sarah Hale had the patriarchal breakdown in mind when she was writing, and she was one of the first people to write off Oaksmith when she became a speaker on the lecture circuit and when she went out for women's rights. So Sarah Hale may have had the position, but she didn't use it on behalf of certain voices. And that was what really galled Oaksmith, because that power was being wasted in those ways. Sarah Hale comes out with a big compendium of poetry in the 1850s. And gosh, there must be 150 lines from Oaksmith's poetry in it, none of which I recognized, because it's all this pious, very poetess, you know, moralistic stuff that she was writing in the early 40s that was appropriate for Hale's publication, but really didn't say anything about what Oaksmith thought women needed to hear.
Well, let's go ahead and wrap up. Do you mind, Ed reminds me that I'd like for Brad to tell us again your title and where the book is and how we might be able to get a hold of it.
Well, you can't get it unless you email me. No, it's in manuscript, and it's I really I finished it at the end of the fall. It took a long time, and so it's, you know, it will go out for sale pretty soon. I don't mean for sale like you can buy it, but through the process. So it's still early days, but I'll have Tim. I'll come and flog, if it gets, you know, printed, I'll come and flog the book here, you know. Commercial. It's called The Shadow of the Hunter at this point, which is a chapter of William O'Connor's novel Harrington. It's one of the chapter titles, and I just thought it was great, so I tried to work it in. So.
Oh, great. All right. Well, I want to thank you both so much. And also, I want to just thank all of our participants today. It's been a pleasure to host these PSA online Zoom forums for over a year now, and it'll be a bit of a change for me to just be an attendee, but I am definitely looking forward to it. And I hope to see many of you either in person or online in April. And everybody have a great day. Thanks again to Brad and Tim. Well done.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Amy. Really, thank you very much. Everybody who came. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you. Bye-bye, all.
A good one.
Go ahead and shut down now.